Welcome to the Wheels of History podcast, episode 1. I'm your host, Brian Boyles, and today's episode is part 1 of a 4-part series on the Six-Day War that took place in June 1967 between Israel and the Arab nations of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. In order to understand the background of this war and the broader tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors, this episode discusses the history of Israel and the region of Palestine, going back as far as 2000 BC. Fight, outnumbered, and win. This phrase describes the problem set faced by the United States Army and our NATO allies in the Cold War, where in Eastern Europe, the Soviets had over 1 million men with their Warsaw Pact allies, and they outnumbered us in virtually every category of equipment. And so our challenge was, how do we train our soldiers and prepare them to fight and win without having to resort to nuclear weapons? How do we get the right training, quality of equipment, and so forth so we can achieve victory on the battlefield? And there's a historical precedent for that too. In the 1960s, an army that was outnumbered went on the offensive and won decisively. And the war I'm talking about came to be known as the Six-Day War that took place in June 1967. Israel fought and defeated the armies of Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in 6 days, fighting on 3 fronts, oftentimes outnumbered and in many cases fighting with comparable or inferior equipment. But it wasn't just a close fight, it was a complete rout. To hear it from the words of an Egyptian officer with the 2nd Armored Brigade, Dr. Abdel Fattah al-Tarki, he said, quote, "Everybody lost their heads. We were told to withdraw to Bir al-Tamada, but we arrived to find the position there already in flames. The army on the roads was in a state of complete collapse. It was a massacre, a disaster. Israel never would have achieved a quarter of its victory if not for the confusion and chaos." End quote. So what happened? How could a small nation, surrounded by its enemies, so decisively defeat their opponents? And the impact of this war echoes throughout the decades, even today. The recent war between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip has had many people say, well, if Israel returned to their pre-1967 borders and we had our two-state solution, there'd be peace in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, about a year ago, stated, well, if Israel would withdraw to its 67 borders, then Saudi Arabia and a bunch of other Arab nations would officially recognize Israel as a country. This war, the 1967 war, is the one that redrew the borders in the region, and some claim that the outcome of this war is the source of many of the ongoing conflicts and contention in the region. Now, one of the things that I love about history is trying to put myself in someone else's shoes, to see the world as they saw it, understand why they made the decisions they did. And dates and facts are certainly part of the history, but they're just the landmarks that tie together the broader narrative, the human story, the desires, the dreams, the fears, the victories, the defeats, all of that go along with it. And that's the story that I want to tell you. So, welcome to the Wheels of History podcast. Please sit back, relax, and let me tell you the story of the Six-Day War. Now, before I begin this series, I just want to make it clear that this work does not represent the stance or opinions of the U.S. government or military. The content in this podcast is solely based on my research and my personal opinions. Also, please keep in mind that I am not a professional historian. In producing this series, I have read several books on the subject, but I do not have the time to exhaustively research each topic. That being said, let's get on with the show. As an American, it's hard to imagine what it's like to live in a small country surrounded by powerful rivals. America is a large country. It takes 5 days to drive from one side to the other. There are hundreds of millions of people here, and while we might lament the challenges of border security along our southern border, we haven't faced a foe who has challenged the nation's homeland since 1812, when the British burned Washington, D.C. In contrast, the Israel of 1967 was incredibly small. From the West Bank, which was occupied by Jordan at the time, Israel is only 9 miles across, which is short enough that you can shoot artillery rounds across there. Tel Aviv, which had 15% of the country's population, was only 12 miles from the West Bank and still under artillery range. At its widest point between the Dead Sea and the Gaza Strip, Israel is 85 miles wide. Now, north to south, Israel is a bit larger, 290 miles from its northern border to its port on the Red Sea at Eilat, but much of this region is the Negev Desert in the south and very sparsely populated. So the populated area of Israel is really about 140 miles wide north to south, at its widest 85 miles wide, though much of that is narrower due to the West Bank. And while this may not seem to make much of a difference if you're a country like Switzerland, where you're surrounded by mountains, and the neighboring countries, at least in recent history, have been relatively friendly, but Israel from its birth in 1948 has been surrounded by enemies who are larger, more populous than them, and many of whom do not recognize its right to exist, even today. But before we get into what happened in 1967, we need to go back to the beginning. And in the Middle East, that really means the beginning in the book of Genesis. The Jewish people trace their lineage back to Abram, who would later have his name changed to Abraham, a migrant around 2100 BC, who lived originally in Mesopotamia, but God told him to move and settle in Canaan, which is in modern-day Israel. A few generations later, Joseph, Abraham's great-grandson, is beaten up and sold to slavers by his 11 brothers, and he ends up being a slave in Egypt. Providentially, God intervenes, allows him to interpret Pharaoh's dreams, and he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man to guide Egypt through the coming 7-year famine. And through this, God saved Joseph's entire extended family by bringing them down to Egypt to live there. Now, Joseph and his 11 brothers become the 12 tribes of Israel. 400 years later, after Egypt had enslaved the Israelites, God delivers them from captivity by working through Moses and his brother Aaron, along with his power in the 12 plagues, parting the Red Sea and crushing Pharaoh's army. And God brought them into the Sinai desert, and there God gave them his law, the 10 Commandments, and prepared them to conquer the Promised Land. That was detoured slightly due to their disobedience and worshiping idols. So after 40 years, God eventually brings them into the Promised Land, starting with the Battle of Jericho and ending several decades later with the land divided between each of the 12 tribes. Now, the borders of Israel back in the Bible in the Old Testament is roughly similar to that of modern-day Israel, although 3 tribes were settled on the east bank of the Jordan River, and the southern border didn't reach all the way to the Red Sea. And all this happened around 1400 BC. A couple centuries later, the Israelites established a monarchy, first under King Saul, and then King David in 1004 BC establishes Jerusalem as the capital of the kingdom of Israel. And this is where God directs that the temple would be built. Up to this point, since going to the Sinai and fleeing from Egypt, the Israelites had worshipped God in the tabernacle, which was a tent that the Israelites could move with them as they advanced into the Promised Land under God's direction. And now, finally, with their capital, the monarchy established, God tells them to build a temple. And the temple was the central point for worship for the Jewish people. This is where they would perform the sacrifices, where the priests were, where God was seen as being residing with his people, and it's where the people would come to God and get atonement for their sins from the sacrifice of the animals. And so Jerusalem was the focal point of the Jewish nation, both politically speaking as their capital, and spiritually as the center point for their worship of God. Now, following King Solomon's reign, the kingdom of Israel split into 2 separate kingdoms thanks to the harsh rule and mismanagement by Solomon's son, Jeroboam. Now remember, there are 12 tribes of Israel that were assigned land in the Promised Land. The southern kingdom, known as the Kingdom of Judah, had 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and its capital was Jerusalem. The northern kingdom, known as the Kingdom of Israel, had 10 tribes, and its capital moved a few times over a century or 2 and eventually became Samaria. Now Judah remained faithful to God. The kings of Judah continued the rule of King David's line, and this is the lineage of Jesus, the lineage that the Messiah would come from. And this is why the Romans named the province Judea and how the Jewish people and religion got its name. Now the northern kingdom of Israel quickly abandoned God and worshipped idols, and members of the northern tribes that still did worship God, they ended up fleeing to Judah. Now after several hundred years of apostasy, the Assyrians conquered Israel in 723 BC, and this was seen as God's judgment on the northern kingdom for going astray and worshiping idols. The kingdom of Judah remained faithful for longer, but eventually its kings also went astray, and the people did too, and they would worship idols. And so, as God's judgment on the southern kingdom for their apostasy, the Babylonians came in, they conquered the area, capturing Jerusalem, and destroyed the temple in 597 BC. Furthermore, many of the Jewish people were taken into exile in Babylon in captivity, where they would remain for many decades. Now, a little bit later, the Persians rose up and overthrew the Babylonians, and Cyrus the Great let the exiles return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple in 536 BC. Now, an important part of the narrative here is that God punishing his people for their disobedience, eventually ending in the exile, but God did not abandon his people. And after a period of time of about 70 years, God brought his people back into their homeland to rebuild their temple and to worship him again. And ironically enough, the Persians actually provided money and funds and resources to do this. So it was God providing a way for his people to come back. And the Jewish people came back, they rebuilt the temple, and they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem, and they lived there for several hundred more years. The Persian Empire fell to Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great Empire split up into its successor empires under his generals, and then eventually around 167 BC, Jewish people revolted and became an independent country. This was the Maccabean Revolt, and they remained an independent country until 63 BC when the Romans conquered them, and eventually they became the Roman province of Judea. Now, one of the Jewish kings that ruled under Roman authority was the King Herod from the Bible. And King Herod, one of his feats was that he did a lot of building projects. And in particular, he greatly expanded the Second Temple and built the Temple Mount, which still stands in Jerusalem to this day. Now, the Jewish people revolted against Roman rule several times. Most notably, there's the Great Jewish Revolt between 66 and 73 AD. And as a result of that revolt, when it was finally put down, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And then there was a second Jewish revolt from 132 to 136 AD, after which the Romans were so fed up with the Jewish people, they renamed the province from Judea to Syria Palestinia, or Palestinian Syria. And this was a reference to the Philistines, who lived on the Mediterranean coast back when the original kingdom of Israel existed. And one of the Philistines was Goliath, of the David and Goliath account. And the Roman people banned the Jewish people from living around Jerusalem and actually founded a Roman colony in the ruins, Aelia Capitolina. And this led to the dispersion of Jewish people throughout the world. Some of them were sold as slaves from the wars, refugees, although a sizable portion still lived in this Roman Palestine. Things continued to progress poorly for the Jewish people over the following 1,800 years. After 600 years of Roman rule, in 638 AD, Muslim conquerors took control of the land, and it remained in Islamic hands for pretty much the remainder of the time period, with the exception of the Crusader states between 1098 and 1291 AD, where portions of modern-day Israel were under control of the Christian Crusaders. Now, despite some rulers having favorable policies towards the Jews or encouraging them to return, in general, the governments in charge discriminated against the Jewish people socially and economically. And so by the time the Ottoman Empire took control of the region in the early 1500s, the Jewish population was in the thousands, down from the millions at the time of Christ. One of the amazing aspects of the Jewish people, though, is that despite being dispersed from their homeland for nearly 2,000 years, a core remnant of the Jewish people still retained their cultural and religious identity distinct from the various nations that they resided in throughout Europe, Africa, Asia, and eventually America. Jerusalem still remained central to the Jewish identity and homeland, and a common phrase sung by Jewish people celebrating their annual Passover was "next year in Jerusalem." Around the 1800s, a movement that came to be known as the Zionist movement began gathering momentum, and that was for the Jewish people to return to their homeland. And many Jews started moving back to Palestine and the Ottoman Empire and started buying land and settling there. Now, during World War I, the Ottoman Empire fought on the side of the Central Powers, aligned with Germany and Austria-Hungary, and as such, the British waged war against the Ottomans, most famously supporting the Arab Revolt, that's the Lawrence of Arabia story, and mounting conventional attacks into Palestine and modern-day Iraq. Now, during the war, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur James Balfour, made something known as the Balfour Declaration. This was in November 1917, and he expressed British support for establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. He was trying to compromise between the large Muslim populations in the region, and so establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, as opposed to making Palestine a Jewish state, would allow the Arabs to continue living in the region while there was a separate state for the Jews to live in. Following the victory in World War I, the British and the French were given a mandate to control the region, France controlling Syria and Lebanon, the British controlling Palestine and Transjordan. And the Balfour Declaration was formally approved by the League of Nations in 1922. And there were waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine, and also this was also in response to anti-Semitism in European countries such as Poland and Germany. Of course, the Arabs don't like this, and that led to a lot of rioting and violent reactions. And so in the 30s, the British government proposed partitioning Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state, a two-state solution. But the Arabs rejected it. They wanted Palestine to remain Arab, and they didn't want the Jews to be a part of it. In 1936, the Arabs in Palestine revolted, starting with the 6-month general strike, unrest and fighting between the Jews and Arabs in Palestine, and this revolt continued for several years. This led to something known as the Peel Commission to investigate the causes of the unrest, and the conclusion was that the League of Nations mandate was unworkable. They recommended partitioning the region to a Jewish and Arab state, with Jerusalem and a corridor to the sea remaining under British control. But the Arabs opposed it and condemned it because they don't want a Jewish state at all or any Jewish immigration into the region. In 1939, the British changed their policy, limiting immigration to the region, specifically Jewish immigration, and eventually stopping it. And they wrote a white paper aimed at gaining Arab support in the face of the coming war against Germany. Now, at this point, the population of Jews in Palestine had grown from about 100,000 at the end of World War I to about 600,000, and there were about 1 million Arabs in the region. Now, World War II happens, and in particular, the Holocaust devastates the Jewish population in Europe. Some 6 million Jews were murdered by the Nazi regime, and this greatly increased sympathy and support around the world for establishing a Jewish state in their historic homeland. Unrest continues in Palestine and the Arab world as the British turn the issue over to the United Nations in 1947. And the UN General Assembly voted to divide Palestine into 2 states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Jerusalem remaining under international control. This is UN General Assembly Resolution 181, which passed in November 29, 1947. Now, the Arabs immediately oppose it, and the next day a war breaks out. The Palestinians attack Jewish settlements and blockade the roads between them. The Jews fight back with weapons that they had smuggled in over the years to defend themselves. And on May 14, 1948, the day before the British mandate over Palestine expired, Israel declares its independence and is immediately recognized by several nations such as the United States, the Soviet Union, and other nations around the world. Now, in doing research for this project, I went and looked at a few pro-Palestinian websites to try and understand both sides of the issue. And a common theme in these websites, they talk about Jewish, quote, colonialism, end quote, in the settler movement, that is the Zionist movement, to come back to Palestine. And their arguments against a Jewish state are rooted in a few key points. The first one being that the Arab people living in Palestine have lived there for hundreds of years, and the Jews are the recent immigrants, the colonial settlers, done under the auspices of the Europeans with all the common associations of imperialism and colonialism and those negative connotations. Furthermore, they point out that the UN resolution for Israel was non-binding. It was only passed in the General Assembly and not by the Security Council. and that the UN resolution and the British plans for partition into two states deprived the Arab inhabitants of Palestine of their right of self-determination. They point out that at the end of the mandate, the Jewish people were only about a third of the population, and they only owned about 6% of the land, so no majority in the region and their recent arrivals, and that the partition plan would have the Arabs give away their land to a minority of recently arrived settlers. Now, there are some significant holes in this argument. Of note, this website talks about the history of the region and doing a very big hand wave and completely ignoring the existence of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, which existed for over 500 years, and them being there for far, far, far before the Arab Palestinians ever arrived in the region. And furthermore, they ignore the fact that the partition plan did not force Arab inhabitants to give away their land or abandon it. It simply gerrymandered the borders so that the Jewish populations would have a slight majority, about 60% to 40%, in the Jewish state. And you kind of need that if you want to actually have a state where the Jewish people can practice their beliefs freely and avoid the circumstances that would lead to the Holocaust, where you have a majority oppressing and ultimately committing genocide against the minority. You kind of need to have a Jewish majority for that to happen. Now, again, as Americans, it's easy to be distant from the emotions and the feelings of being there in the land and fighting over this conflict. So to make this matter a bit more personal for Americans, try to imagine this scenario. Imagine you're an American living in, say, northern Georgia, and your family's lived there for many generations, going back over 100 years. However, in recent years, a number of Native Americans, Cherokee Indians, have started moving to the region and buying land there. Now, the Cherokee Indians, if we recall correctly, were forcibly removed from the region in the early 1800s in the Trail of Tears. And in this alternate reality, suppose there is no Cherokee Indian reservation where the government moved them to. Instead, the Cherokee are dispersed across the broader United States, where they continue to practice their beliefs and customs in isolation. Now, in recent years, there's a rise in hatred toward the Cherokee. Hate crimes, lynchings, and more. And so a movement forms where the Cherokee start wanting to return back to their historic homeland in Georgia. And so the Cherokee start moving back to the region and legally buy land, but this causes tensions with the local residents. And the federal government decides to develop a plan to form an autonomous region in North Georgia where the Cherokee can live and govern according to their beliefs. This plan accelerates Cherokee immigration to the region, but it causes local residents to start protesting and then rioting because they are vehemently set against the plan. The government goes through several iterations of the plan over a series of years, trying to find some compromise where there can be both the Cherokee reservation and the local Georgians having a place where they can live, but the locals reject it out of hand. Other people argue that the Georgians could simply move out of the designated reservation if they don't want to live there, and remain in northern Georgia and some of the other regions. But there's no progress and no compromise. And so the federal plan proceeds and is approved by Congress to establish this autonomous reservation, but it stalls in the executive branch. And at this impasse, Georgia decides to mobilize its National Guard and move into the Cherokee region to establish their rule by force. The Cherokee have weapons of their own, they start fighting back, and war breaks out. Now, this is not a perfect analogy, but hopefully it helps illustrate some of the emotions and the grievances and the tensions that arose in the Middle East. You have anger and resentment when a people group arrives in the area with a different culture and beliefs. There's no desire to compromise. The Arabs have the my way or the highway analogy. They do not want any Jewish state anywhere. They want all of Palestine under Arab rule. And people are ignoring the historical and cultural ties, plus the oppression against the immigrants that served as a catalyst for the movement back. And finally, instead of negotiation and diplomacy and trying to come to a compromise solution, instead there's a resort to violence as a means to address the problem. Now, the Jewish state established by the United Nations has completely indefensible borders, far worse than the borders Israel would have in 1967. They had no access to Jerusalem. And not only are they in a very poor geographic and military situation, but after declaring independence, the Arab nations of Egypt, Transjordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon go to war against Israel and effectively occupy the Palestinian state. The Arab nations do not recognize Israel's right to exist. They don't want to compromise. Basically, they think that all of Palestine must be Arab, and much to their surprise and the world's surprise, Israel managed to hold on to the land that they were allotted by the United Nations and actually managed to gain territory throughout this war. Between 48 and 49, despite being outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded, the Israelis were able to secure some key terrain, particularly a corridor to Jerusalem. They're able to capture the western part of the city, but not the old city with the Temple Mount. They're able to expand into the Negev Desert to the south and make their lines a bit more defensible. During the war, Transjordan occupies the West Bank, and they changed their name to Jordan, since Transjordan means the land east of the Jordan River. Now they're occupying land on both sides of the Jordan River. Egypt occupies the Gaza Strip. Syria occupies the Golan Heights along their border with Israel. Now, the Israel in 1949 is about 30% larger than that assigned to it by the United Nations. It still lacks strategic depth, but it is more defensible, and it actually has a solid Jewish majority. This is in part due to the refugees, the Palestinian Arabs that fled Israel over the course of the war. In large part, that was due to the ongoing fighting or the encouragement by the Arabs to leave during the fighting because they're going to come back and conquer it back anyways. Part of it was evictions, and also because in the Muslim world, about 800,000 Jews were evicted from their homes, and they come to Israel and settle in Israel. So that's kind of ironic, but if the Arabs had actually accepted the 1947 UN partition plan, Israel would have been smaller, less defensible, and demographically, the Arabs would have been about 45% of the population. Now, a notable outcome of the war is that the Israelis control the town of Eilat on the Red Sea, which allows them access to the Indian Ocean. And though the town did not have port facilities to begin with, these were built and expanded upon in the years following Israeli independence. Now, in the United States, our notion of peace and war is a pretty binary option, right? If you're at war, you're out there, you're fighting, under attack, whatnot. But when the war is over, peace is declared, we go home, we demobilize the troops, and we enjoy the fruits of peace, right? Not so in the Middle East, because the Arab nations around Israel still don't recognize Israel's right to exist after the armistice, and they even refer to Israel's independence as the catastrophe. There were a lot of refugees, about 750,000 Palestinians fled Israel during the war. A lot of these ended up in the Gaza Strip or the West Bank. There were also several 100,000 Jewish refugees from the wider Arab world that are forced out of their countries and settle in Israel. But there's no permanent peace. The armistice, which is an agreement to cease hostilities but not an official end to the war, is marked by continual small-scale fighting. The Arab nations say, well, there is no Israel. I mean, there's an Israeli army there and they're occupying land, but Israel doesn't have any actual borders. They're just arbitrary lines by the armistice. And they view it as a temporary truce, but not a peace. The Egyptians, they blockade Israeli access to the Red Sea. South of Eilat, there's this geographic point called the Straits of Tiran at the southern end of the Sinai Peninsula, where the waters are about 7 miles wide and can be effectively blocked by artillery. So Israeli flagged ships going through the Straits of Tiran are stopped. Same things, Israeli ships going through the Suez Canal are seized by the Egyptians. Meanwhile, on the Syrian border, on the Golan Heights, artillery there is overlooking the Jewish farming communities along the Jordan River and the Sea of Galilee, and they periodically shoot artillery rounds at the Jewish communities. The Egyptians sponsor Palestinian guerrilla raids into Israel as early as 1953, and these raids escalate over the course of time. Between 1949 and 1956, about 500 civilians are killed. And out of a population of 1.6 million people in Israel, in relative terms, that's the equivalent to 14,000 U.S. civilians being murdered every year by guerrillas. Furthermore, all major Israeli cities are within artillery range of the Arab nations. And so the Israelis respond with low-level violence and reprisal raids of their own, And so there's this continual low-level violence where people are dying on both sides in the years following Israel's independence. Most notably, Soviet support for Israel switches in 1954 to supporting the Arabs, because originally they were supporting Israel as being anti-imperialist and sticking it to the British Empire and the French and so forth. And then they realized that, well, Israel's not going to become a communist nation. And they saw supporting the Arab nations in the area as a counter to Western influence in Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan. And then the Soviets started branding Israel as being the imperialist occupiers, ironically. Anyways, so time passes. Several years later, in 1952, the Egyptian monarchy is overthrown in a military coup. One of those officers, Gamal Abdel Nasser, becomes the prime minister, and in 1956 he becomes the president. Now, Nasser's claim to fame is that he's a pan-Arabist. He wants to unify the Arab world under one flag, and overthrowing those borders that have been drawn by European imperial powers, overthrowing the monarchies that they put in place, and having the Arab people rule themselves. In 1955, Egypt becomes the dominant military power in the region, thanks to buying large quantities of Soviet military equipment, including modern tanks, jet aircraft, and artillery. A year later, shortly after the last British troops depart from the Suez Canal, he nationalizes the Suez Canal and takes control of it. Now, just for some context here, Egypt had been part of the British Empire since 1882. It was later a protectorate starting in 1914, and nominally independent since 1922, although there is still very significant British control and influence. And the Suez Canal is a critical link for the British Empire to reach their possessions in India and the Far East. And so this remains under British control and administration even after Egypt is an independent country. So Nasser takes control of the Suez Canal as a blow to British imperialism, and he figures, hey, this will allow Egypt to benefit from the profits of running the canal, and besides, the canal goes through Egypt, so it should be ours. And once that happens, the British and the French start mobilizing for action. They were the largest shareholders in the Suez Canal. The French at the time are fighting an insurgency in Algeria, which Egypt is supporting, and the British want to depose Nasser, who, being the pan-Arabist, is trying to undermine their allies such as Jordan and Iraq, who have monarchies in place. Now, Nasser is expecting some sort of reaction from the West after he nationalizes the canal, and so he masses his army along the Mediterranean coast, in particular around Cairo and Alexandria, the major cities. And so the French and the British come up with a plan. They're going to enlist Israeli help to invade the Sinai Peninsula, and that's going to draw the Egyptian army away. And oh yes, that'll also provide a convenient pretext for intervening and seizing control of the canal, to protect the canal. Now, the Israelis' viewpoint is that they do support this action because they see it as an opportunity to knock Nasser and Egypt down a few pegs, especially given their growing military and political power and the ongoing violence and the guerrilla raids Egypt had been sponsoring from the Gaza Strip into Israel. But Israel's main concern is that they want to make sure they're going into this, that they have the backing of the French and the British. Because if Israel goes to war and the British and the French don't intervene, now all of a sudden Israel's committed itself to fighting the Egyptians, and that leaves their back door open in the east and in the north against Jordan and Syria, who can walk in the back door and take over Israel. And at this time, the Israeli army is still in its formative stages. It is much better equipped than it was in 1948. They actually have tanks and aircraft and artillery, but there's still a lot of doctrinal debates over, well, does the infantry have primacy over the armor? How do we balance decentralized execution and central command? And there are a lot of still growing pains the Israeli army is going through. Well, regardless, war commences on October 29th, 1956. The Israelis do a paratrooper landing at Mitla Pass, which is in the western Sinai, close to the Suez Canal, and the Israeli ground forces began advancing overland to link up with them. Now, this move catches Nasser completely off guard. He was expecting the Europeans to come from the sea, not the Israelis to attack in the Sinai. And as a note on the geography of the Sinai, so the Sinai Peninsula is a triangular-shaped piece of desert. Suez Canal is on the western side, the Israeli border is on the eastern side. And while it's a desert, there's a lot of different kinds of desert in the world. The southern portion of the Sinai Peninsula is very rugged and mountainous. The northern section has a small coastal road, but there are a lot of sand dunes and trafficability. It doesn't really support a lot of traffic or large army movements. And really the central route through the peninsula is the only one capable of significant logistical support. It's that main avenue of approach between Israel and Egypt. And then on the western side of the peninsula is a mountain range with several passes, one of them being Mitla Pass, which after that gains access to the canal. So the Israeli army, they do have tanks nowadays in 1956. They are armed mostly with Sherman tanks and AMX-13 light tanks. But in general, the Israelis seek decentralized command with a strong emphasis on initiative among their junior officers and soldiers. So their division equivalent, called an Ugda, it doesn't have a large staff. There are no permanent formations or enablers attached to it. It's really more of just a coordinating organization, and the brigades are seen as their main units of action. And the Israeli attacks go forward. They penetrate the Egyptian line, but the Egyptians put up stubborn resistance, particularly along that central route and a town called Abu Agelia, and a ridgeline nearby known as Katef. And the Egyptian forces there are surrounded by the Israelis, but contrary to some of the Israeli thought at the time, the Egyptians did not collapse or run away when they were surrounded. They fought stubbornly in their defensive positions, and they actually held out till pretty much the end of the war. Eventually they withdrew of their own accord, but the Israelis did not have a lot of success in storming those fortifications. Thankfully for the Israelis, 2 days into the war, the Anglo-French forces intervene. Thanks to 5 aircraft carriers and land-based aviation, they effectively eliminate the Egyptian Air Force, and they start landing troops along the canal starting on November 4th. And this catches the Egyptians off guard because they were just repositioning their forces to fight the Israelis, and now with the Anglo-French intervention, Nasser decides to withdraw his forces from the Sinai back across the canal to protect the population centers in Egypt. Now, unfortunately for the French and the British, their campaign is derailed by not only the Soviet Union, but, to some people's surprise, the United States. President Eisenhower saw this as an imperialist move, the old imperial powers trying to reassert themselves in the world. And so when the Anglo-French intervention began, the Chief of Naval Operations, Arleigh Burke, he signaled the U.S. Sixth Fleet Commander in the Mediterranean, Admiral Brown, "Situation tense, prepare for imminent hostilities." And his response was, "Am prepared for imminent hostilities, but whose side are we on?" And so this marked the passing of the old world order, the U.S. and the Soviets effectively vetoing a move by 2 of the great powers of Europe. And ultimately, under this pressure, the French and the British withdraw, though Israel is left in possession of the Sinai. Now the Egyptians blame their defeat on the European intervention. They say the Israelis had nothing to do with our defeat. It was just because the French and the British intervened, that's why we lost. And they actually held up their example of defending Abu Agelia as an example of them stopping the Israelis, and many officers in the Egyptian army believed that if it weren't for the Europeans, that war would have ended with them marching on Tel Aviv and conquering Israel. Now, over the next year or so, there are some negotiations. Israel eventually withdraws from the Sinai Peninsula about 6 months later, but their main concern is that they want freedom of navigation through the Straits of Tiran so that they can get shipping from Eilat, that port on the Red Sea, out into the Indian Ocean. And they also want protection against the cross-border guerrilla raids that the Egyptians had been supporting from Gaza Strip. So what ends up happening is the United Nations intervenes. The UNEF, the United Nations Emergency Force, is formed, and they're inserted along the Gaza Strip, the border between Israel and Egypt, and in the Straits of Tiran, in order to help stand in the way between the Egyptians and the Israelis to limit the violence. And so this allows the Red Sea to be open to Israeli shipping, provides them a key access to Asian and African markets, and particularly getting oil from Iran. Remember, this is when the Shah was still ruling Iran, and Iran was a pro-Western country. Nasser is able to maintain his political clout because the Suez Canal remained under his control. He blames defeat on the French and the British, and he decides to focus his efforts not on Israel, but on uniting the Arab world for an eventual move on Israel. He sees, hey, we need to build our power, we need to consolidate, and then we're going to crush Israel when we're unified. We don't want to fight them right now. So Nasser is able to claim victory. He keeps up his belligerent rhetoric against Israel and denouncing them, but in practice, he really is putting minimal forces in the Sinai, leaving Israeli shipping in the Straits of Tiran alone, and focusing his efforts on unifying the Arab world. And Israel is satisfied too. They have some breathing space, they have time to consolidate and grow stronger, and following this point, there really was no more talk of partitioning Israel to appease the Arabs. There were a number of plans drawn up by the United States prior to the 56 war, talking about, well, if we partition Israel and do this, then that can give us some credence in the Arab world and it can bring peace to the Middle East. Following this point here, at least amongst the West, we recognize Israel is here to stay. Now we'll get more into the specific causes that led to the Six-Day War in the next episode. But some of the key takeaways from this is that the Jewish people have a very strong historic, cultural, and religious tie to the Holy Land and specifically to Jerusalem and the Temple. And even though the Jews were dispersed for 1,800 years in foreign countries, they retained their cultural and religious identity, even in the face of persecution, hatred, or genocide. And the Jewish people that desire to return to their homeland was realized through the Zionist movement and eventually the creation of Israel in 1948. Now this was done amidst intense opposition from the Arab people living in the region and surrounding countries, whether it be the stubborn refusal by the Arabs to a two-state solution throughout the interwar period and post-World War II, to the declaration of war against Israel the day that Israel became its own nation. All the surrounding nations went to war with Israel. Even in their defeat, they still did not recognize Israel's right to exist as a nation, continued to talk about wiping Israel off the face of the earth, and continued low-level violence, whether it be guerrilla attacks against civilians, shelling villages, or small-scale military action across the border. In the Suez War, the Israelis were able to fight and defeat the Egyptians with the help of the French and the British, but there's still that continual violence. There's not the acceptance in the Arab world that Israel has a right to exist. And so the Israeli mindset, coming out of the Holocaust, they have the never again mindset. They finally have their own homeland again after 1,800 years, and they are determined to defend it. So they see the need to defend themselves, and they see themselves as a skilled fighter. One-on-one, the Israelis' defense forces are more than a match for their Arab neighbors. But they have no margin for error. It's like you have a lightweight boxer who can duck and dodge and land blows left and right, surrounded by 5 large thugs, where things are going pretty good, but if the enemy connects with a solid blow, Israel's down for the count. They are a skilled fighter, but they're surrounded, they're outnumbered, and there's no margin for error. If the Israelis lose one war, they have lost their entire country and all their people. There's the pro-Palestinian slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That's a reference to from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, which is all of the state of Israel. It's saying that all is really Palestinian and the Israelis need to be gone. And so in this mindset, the Israelis have both the confidence saying, hey, we can beat our neighbors and we can fight and defend ourselves, but they're also afraid because there is no margin for error. If they lose once, there is no more Israel. All right, that's it for this episode. Tune in next time on the Wheels of History podcast, where you'll hear about the road to war and how the increasing tensions in the regions and the Arab nations egging each other on eventually led to the Six-Day War. Thank you. I'll see you next time.